What images does France conjure up for you? Now, for me, there are beautiful houses and gardens of all kinds, but also glorious markets, street cafes, and some very formative experiences.
When I was 19, I came to the south of France and lived in Aix-en-Provence for 6 months. And ever since then, I've loved France and everything to do with it. And I want to share that passion for the country with you through its gardens.
I'll be travelling the byways of the French countryside.
This is what a deux chevaux was made for.
Meeting local gardeners.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Monty. Bonjour, José.
Tasting the very best of their harvest.
Sometimes this job is really good.
Getting to turn on huge fountains.
I can hear the water.
And trying to find out what makes French gardens, and indeed the French, unique.
Today, I shall be looking both at the gardens of artists and gardens that are works of art in their own right.
I'll be visiting gardens portrayed by painters like Claude Monet and Paul Cézanne, as well as the work of France's most interesting contemporary designers. And I'll be trying to find out at what point the French think that a garden transcends horticulture and becomes a work of art. This is Café Nemours, in the heart of Paris, just round the corner from the Louvre.
S'il vous plaît. Merci.
Paris has always attracted artists and intellectuals.
I remember my grandfather, who died 30 years ago when he was nearly 100, telling me how that he came and lived and worked in Paris in 1901. And that it was a very sexy, free city where they did the can-can, and there was the Moulin Rouge. Paris was somewhere that was sophisticated, where art was respected and was very creative. So just to come and sit and watch street life go by was more exciting than anything else you could get in Britain. It still is.
That sense of creative freedom can perhaps be dated back to the exhibition at the Louvre in 1863, which included for the first time the early work of a radical group of artists, now known as the Impressionists. Painting directly from nature, painters like Paul Cézanne and Claude Monet embraced light and colour as their central themes, attempting to capture the essence of a single moment in their canvases. And gardens, nature at its most domestic and accessible, were to be a common subject of their paintings. A series of the most famous of all Impressionist paintings are displayed here in the Orangerie in the Tuileries Gardens. They are the 8 Nymphae, Monet's canvases of water lilies, inspired by the water garden he created and then painted again and again.
Of course, the really overwhelming thing is the scale. These are simply enormous paintings. They're bigger than most ponds. The scale is celestial. What's really interesting is that these have become almost completely abstract. It's as though Monet has immersed himself so closely and nearly with what he's painting. I mean, I see him standing right close to the canvas, that he's not really painting the garden anymore. He's painting what the garden means. He's painting light and color and the fact that it's water. It's bouncing off and it's becoming abstract and metaphysical. And that's beautiful. That's inspiring. But he's taken the garden and gone beyond.
To find out more about Monet's paintings, I want to go to the source of his inspiration. So I'm leaving Paris and going west to visit his garden in Normandy that he made in a small village on the banks of the Seine.
This is Giverny, the garden of Claude Monet, and it's a garden I know. I've been here twice before, but never before in April.
Monet found this old cider farm in the village of Giverny in the spring of 1883, and he was looking for a home to rent for his young and growing family. At the age of 43, he was already an experienced gardener and was to spend the remaining 43 years of his life obsessed by this garden. As soon as he moved in, he set to work transforming the orchard in front of the farmhouse.
The first thing that strikes me is how fresh everything is. When I came here first time, it was high summer, and actually it was surprisingly, not drab, that's the wrong word, but it was overwhelmed with foliage and in-between colour phases. And then when I came here in late spring, the colour was incredibly intense, but now there is a lightness and almost sort of the colours dance above the borders. It's lovely.
Monet laid the garden out in blocks of colour like an artist's palette, mixing simple flowers like daisies and poppies with more unusual varieties like the species tulips. In fact, he grew increasingly particular about the exact varieties that would give him the texture and colour he wanted to paint. And once said, "I perhaps owe having become a painter to flowers." In the process of making the garden, he transformed the site. But he didn't always get his own way.
This central alley was flanked, when he came here, with trees. There were fir trees and yew trees. Now, he cut some down and put up these arches on the site of where the trees were. But his wife, Alice, wouldn't let him cut down the fir trees that were there, although they were clearly pretty horrid and inappropriate. So he kept them, but then he obviously worked on her for a bit because he was allowed to cut all off except for the trunks, which looked really odd. They looked like fat telegraph poles, and he grew roses up them. But then, when she died, with a sort of due period of mourning for tree and wife, he came out and he cut them down.
Monet began painting this part of the garden, which is called the Clos Normand, as soon as he moved in, and continued to do so for the rest of his life. He kept a strict daily routine, rising at dawn and going outside to catch the light. And unlike the hordes of tourists, all trying to snap the whole essence of the garden in one killer shot, this meant that he often worked systematically on a number of canvases simultaneously, moving from one to the other around the garden as the light changed. To maintain the right intensity of colour, he thought nothing of ripping out hundreds of flowers and replacing them almost daily, which is how the garden is still run. James Priest is the English head gardener whose job it is to maintain Monet's legacy.
One of the things I'm interested in is the relationship between artists and gardens. What do you think about that?
I think it's a very good parallel. Is that the artist is working always on canvas, but we're working both with a picture to make and our tools of plans, whereas the artist is using paints, but we're making something according to what theme. And artists have different movements, gardeners have different styles. So we decide on the style we want, and we're trying to make something the most beautiful, harmonious, and the true to a feeling, because an artist to my mind, doesn't just make something that's real and cold. He makes something that has depth to it and feeling and emotion to it. So I think the parallel is very, very close. Monty had to know his colors and how to mix them and how to use them. I have to know my flowers and the colors, how to use them. So technically, two different techniques, but the final result is very comparable.
Do you think Monet was a good gardener or not?
I think that at the end of his life, he was a good gardener. I think at the beginning of his life, like all of us, he had to learn what gardening was about, and so he started very simply.
But it took time.
It took time. It took all his life, yes.
Today, over 600,000 people a year come to appreciate Monty the gardener. 10 years after he first moved to Giverny, Monty sold enough paintings to enable him not only to buy the house and Clos Normand, but also a plot of land over the road and begin to make his famous water garden. The water lilies are not yet in flower, so I shall make a return visit to see them later in the summer. I'm now going south on the TGV to visit a very different garden, which was also the inspiration for a painter that I love. He was a contemporary and friend of Monet's called Paul Cézanne. This means retracing the steps of my much younger self. But back then, the journey from Paris to Marseille took all night. And now it's a mere 3 hours.
The last time I made this journey by train was 1974. I was 19 and looking for light, really. I've become entranced by the paintings of Paul Cézanne and the way that he used light and landscape. And I was completely besotted by this idea of this bright, strong light filtered through landscape. And by then I was gardening a lot, and I felt a sort of deep emotional attraction to growth and soil and landscape, and I painted a little bit. And to see it all come together was thrilling. So down I came, and it was a big adventure.
I still have my journal from those days, and it records the excitement and wonder I felt on my first visit into the light of the South.
Sunday the 13th of October, 1974, I woke at 7 to find myself in broad Provençal sunshine with a train at Arles. And I spent the rest of the journey gazing at Provence. Misty blue mountains, blue sparkling sea, white gleaming rock, olive trees, cypress, firs, so beautiful. Here's me at 19, proudly showing my new berry. I'd obviously just bought that.
I change trains and travel on to Aix-en-Provence. And when I get there, I go straight back to visit some old haunts.
This is Rue Portalis, where I lived when I was in Aix. And it was there, number 20. And I was up on the second floor.
The market is still here at the square at the end of the street. I'd come here and scavenge the leftovers, which were nicer than anything I could get in Britain.
This is a mobilette. I had one similar to it, not actually quite so good, because this is a Solex, where the engine was in front. Mine was underneath. But this curious hybrid of bicycle and motorbike that were really common 30, 40 years ago. Hardly ever see them now. But I was set off bravely, tearing along at 20 miles an hour. And if things got a bit dodgy or you ran out of fuel, you could pedal.
The main reason I was here was to get closer to the paintings that so inspired me. Paul Cézanne was born in Aix in 1839, and he lived here most of his life. He painted the area ceaselessly, distilling the essence of the landscape and the southern light onto canvas. Cézanne lived in his parental home, the Jardin de Bouffin, and painted the garden in every season. Back in the 1970s, I thought that if I went to see the garden, it would teach me something about Cézanne's paintings. But it didn't prove to be that easy.
I wanted to find a Jardin de Bouffin, which I knew was where Cézanne was brought up and where he lived most of his life, actually. And I thought maybe that I could go in and walk around, but anyway, it was no use because the gates were firmly locked and it seemed to be very closed down. It was scruffy, there didn't seem to be any signs of life, no one going in or out, so I hung around for a bit and went away again. Anyway, I now know that I can go in, nearly 40 years later, and at last have a look around.
The garden is very simple. It isn't filled with flowers like Giverny, but Cézanne loved to paint the lines of the trees and the light and the shade filtering through the branches. And all the features that are so recognizable from his paintings are still here. The plane trees, the pool, and the rather grand house itself. In fact, it seems almost untouched since he lived here.
I've got some postcards of Jardin de Bouffin. I want to match them up and see. Oh, it is a very imposing house. See, that's that sort of thing. If you look, there's the house. That's good. Actually, looking at that, I've got another postcard. See, look at that. That postcard there is that. And there's the pond, look. There's the pond, the corner of the pond, which is there. There's the path, much narrower, and there are the avenue, exactly there. So he's standing here and painting that. And in fact, even that little bit there is this here. Is that. That's good. You see, what's exciting about that is that it's not just identifying it. For me, a garden is home, is life, is childhood, memory, dreams, all bound up. You can't separate it. So where Cézanne walked in the garden, let alone where he painted in the garden, connects you to him in a way, it means you smell the same smells, you hear the same things. He would have heard the water trickling. And I think that's just thrilling. I think that's really living, breathing history in a way that just a postcard can't do.
When Cézanne was 60, his mother died, and the house and garden had to be sold. Cézanne built himself a small studio and garden a couple of miles away on the other side of Aix.
It is very lovely. It's one's idea of a villa in the middle of a hot day. And he built it to live in, but he never did. He then transformed it into a studio, but came up here to work every day. And he made a garden from what was farmland. And actually, the garden is not much to look at now, and apparently it never was. The garden wasn't important to him in a horticultural sense, but what he loved and painted a lot were the lines and shapes of stems and branches and light and color filtering through. So it mattered to him, and also having that sort of safety zone around him. This was absolutely his space and clearly fired his creativity. Now it's sort of been let go, and it's interesting. If this was England and this was National Trust, it would be fully restored to exactly the date when Cézanne made it. But I like the way that it's just become itself, and rather suspect that Cézanne would have liked it too.
The garden may have been allowed to grow wild, but the studio is beautifully preserved. And it does feel as though Cézanne has just walked out of the room.
There's a letter to Monty, dated 6th of July, 1895. It's been said of Cézanne that he painted still lives like landscape, and landscape like still lives. And yet he was one of the first people to paint still lives as though he'd just caught them, as though he just got their essence before it drifted away. And that has a spiritual quality and is incredibly beautiful. And in a way, it's not fanciful to compare that to gardening, is that when you're making a garden, or even just enjoying a garden, there is that profound sense of just being in the moment, and you share it, and you know it's going to change. The weather will change, the plant will move on, and it'll never be the same again. But just for a second, you were precisely there. And that's what Cézanne's painting immediately gave me, and has given lots of other people.
I may have had to wait 40 years to come and see his home and gardens, but it's certainly increased my understanding of Cézanne's work.
by coming and walking through his garden and looking at it and letting the light fall and just sitting in it quietly. I've realised something very profoundly that I hadn't quite got from looking at the pictures, which is that it's ordinary. It's just like lots of other people's gardens, bigger than most, but the contents are the same. Nothing special here at all. And what, of course, Cézanne did was take those ordinary elements and utterly transform them. Through genius, he made the private and the domestic, the back garden, into something that everybody in the world realises as truly great art.
Cézanne didn't need to create a garden for it to inspire his art. But the next garden I want to show you was self-consciously made as a work of art in itself. To get there, I am reunited with my favourite French car, but I can't resist visiting a scene that Cézanne painted many times.
I'm driving a 2CV on a twisty, windy Provençal road. On the wrong side of the road is slightly... Oh, here we go.
When I was here as a teenager, I worked in a garden just outside Aix. I loved the journey there because the road took me past the spot where Cézanne repeatedly set up his easel to paint the great outcrop of Mont Saint-Victoire.
Oh, look, you see, there's Mont Saint-Victoire. Incredible view. You see, that still thrills me. What are we now? All this time, I've seen it lots of times, and it's still thrilling. You can imagine what it was like as a 19-year-old. It's exciting now as it was then. So every time I saw it, I was in the painting. I was here in the place where the painting was. And that was such a buzz.
Cézanne painted Mont Saint-Victoire over 80 times. And through his paintings, one can chart his move towards abstraction. By the time he died in 1906, he was increasingly using blocks of colour to build semi-abstract forms. This later work of Cézanne helped inspire a radical new art movement, Cubism. I've come 65 miles to the Riviera town of Hyères to see the world's first Cubist garden.
I couldn't get any breakfast at the hotel, and although it's great being able to get in early and see the garden, I've got to have some coffee before I start. I can't think.
The central idea of Cubism is to show a subject from several perspectives at the same time, and it revolutionized the world in architecture.
The garden I'm heading off to see at this time of day is called Villa Noailles, and it was made in the 1920s as the first truly modern garden in France, because it's a Cubist garden, and was deliberately made, really, as a continuation of the paintings that the Cubists did and the sculptures. So it's part garden, part work of art. And what I don't know is if it's still maintained as it was, if it's retained that sense of sort of shocking, new experimental art. But I'll find out when I've had a cup of coffee.
In 1927, Charles and Marie-Laure de Noailles, aristocratic and hugely wealthy patrons of modern art, decided to build a holiday villa, complete with a Cubist garden. What was unusual, even groundbreaking, was that they commissioned the designer, Gabriel Gavrekian, to make the garden expressly as a work of art.
I was quite worried before coming to see this, because although I'd seen lots of pictures, it looked a bit scruffy. And I couldn't quite see how that it would work as a garden. But it does, it's a relief, because it's all sorts of things. It's charming, it's a piece of history, and it's definitely a piece of art.
It was originally planted with tulips and standard citrus, But from the outset, the plants were always secondary to the planes and shapes of Greveckin's design. It's as though he's taken recognizable elements of the garden, like a gravel path, and reassembled them in different dimensions to create his work.
It's very nice once you're inside it. It's very different, actually, because all the different levels are really working. And although there are no paths, it actually feels reasonable to go. You feel like a chess piece on a chessboard. My move. And it's a very friendly space, I suppose, which is not a word you would associate really with cubism. But it works. I like the way with the cubism that although there are no paths, the paths that there are, the gravel, is at an angle at the wall. So your eye's saying path and yet it's not doing it. It's all part of that cubist mentality of trying to unpick the world and put it back together again in a jumble that makes you see it with fresh eyes. This makes you see a garden with fresh eyes.
When it was made 85 years ago, this garden was revolutionary and challenged all perceptions of what a garden was or might be. The Denoise kept open house for artists and intellectuals, making Villenoy, for a while, the most fashionable artistic centre in the whole of France. Pierre Quillet's grandfather was the butler here during that period.
Et le style de la vie ici, beaucoup de visiteurs.
Énormément, et puis beaucoup d'animations, donc ça a donné beaucoup de fêtes dans la villa.
Et des artistes.
Beaucoup d'artistes. Même à la limite, c'était devenu très difficile pour un jeune artiste à l'époque de ne pas passer par les Noailles pour pouvoir réussir. Le plus célèbre, c'est Dali, lancé par Charles et Maille. À l'époque, ma mère me rapportait qu'il n'avait pas grand-chose à manger, donc il venait piter dans la cuisine pour manger en cachette.
If the planting hasn't stood the test of time, the structure of the garden certainly has, and it's still provocative and interesting. "60 miles north of Vienna is another garden which has been bought and sold as a collector's item. Its every detail was created in direct artistic response to the landscape that surrounds it. But there's something I want to see on the way.
I'm just going to make a little detour because I've heard that there's a lavender field down here, and I want to see lavender growing in its natural habitat, so to speak. Look at that. The thing about lavender grown here is that it's got exactly the conditions it wants. So you've got this very dry limestone. Look at that, it's just powder in my hands. And look how healthy that is. It's just completely found where it wants to be. And when I do that, I'm surprised you can't see the air shimmer with scent. It's so rich and oily, and I'm quite heady, it's almost intoxicating. And what lavender loves is harsh, extreme conditions and really good drainage. But it's surprising that the cherries, the cherries which we think of as Garden of England cherries, but they love it here. Just shows you what they really like. Not quite right, but lovely. That one looks better. Standing in the Provençal sunshine, next to a lavender field, eating cherries. That's quite good.
The garden I'm heading for is called La Louve. is set in some of the most beautiful countryside in the south of France.
It's up there somewhere. I'll find it.
It's in the village of Bogne, in the heart of the Louvre in Provence. I'm coming here to see it as a work of art, but it has also set the standard as the dream Provençal garden.
Good morning. Bonjour.
The garden is modest in size and set on a steep slope in the middle of the village. It was made by Nicole de Vézien, a successful textile designer, using a style that is deceptively simple, based around native plants and natural materials.
I love the way that this garden picks up the rhythm of the place. It does it in a number of ways. The obvious ones are in the outlines and the shapes that follow the landscape. And that's very subtle. It shows that Nicole really looked and really observed and didn't copy, but just picked up on that flow and let it run through the garden.
Nicole didn't base her garden on any rare or unusual plants. These cypresses are native to the region, and lavender, of course, loves it here. It's not what she used, but how she used it, the artistry she employed, that makes La Louvre so special. At every turn, there is a perfectly composed still life. Despite the very awkward site, La Louvre works both as a lovely garden and as a work of art. And whilst it seems deceptively simple, it is in fact edited in every detail.
This garden is a really good example on how to make a small space seem bigger. And it does it by two ways. One is by filling it, and the other is by compressing space. And the easiest way to do that is by having your walkways and your entrances and exits really narrow. And by compressing them down so that you have to sort of squidge through almost and brush against the foliage, which is lovely because there's really good sense, it pushes space in, and then as you come out the other side, it releases it and makes it seem much bigger. And you'll be surprised at how that works every time.
At the age of 80, 10 years after starting La Louvre, Nicole decided to sell her garden because she wanted to make a new one. The art collector Judith Pillsbury was the buyer, and she purchased it as a finished work of art.
It was just a coup de foudre. It was just so beautiful. It was like being able to buy Sissinghurst.
When one is buying into, literally and figuratively, into a garden that's very established, are you obliged to curate it?
Well, I think one is obliged to curate it. I mean, that's what I feel. And I'm an art dealer, so I'm used to taking care of works of art.
The idea of the artists creating their art through the medium of horticulture is one that interests me a lot. Do you think that it's practical, that one can do that?
I don't know that Nicole started out that way. I think that she was someone who just couldn't stop creating. And she had a vision of Provence, which at that time was very new. I mean, she embraced, you know, the vernacular of a peasant garden, hard scrabble, not very many plants. She embraced that, and she turned that into something that was a positive.
Nicole Vézien died 20 years ago, but her style of Provençal garden has become increasingly influential.
Although she made a world-famous garden, the irony is that Nicole de Vézien was conventionally no gardener. She didn't dig the garden at all. there was no attempt to return fertility. She never made compost. She planted much too close together. But she had an absolutely innate feel for two things. One was colour and the other was form. And the colours she's used here are very muted and faded, and they look terrific under a very bright sun. They have a kind of richness and subtle intensity, whereas if you use them under grey skies, that just looks drab. And the other thing that she just had a superb feel for was space. It's a sculptural quality. And her clipping and training, it wasn't just to do with organising the plants themselves, but the space between plants, the space between branches that catches light and the distant horizon is just exquisite. And that's gardening of real high quality. She may not have known how to grow the plants or even their names, but she sure knew how to make them look good.
I left here wondering whether you can make a garden, or indeed a work of art, by accident. Can one drift into the other, or must you set out with a clear purpose and vision? To try and answer this, I've decided to look to the present and ask three of France's contemporary designers what they think the relationship is between their gardens and art. One uses his plants as living sculpture. Another takes the elements of the traditional French formal garden and reinvents them to elegant effect. And the third creates gardens that climb vertically on the walls of inner-city buildings. This one is on the Quai Branly in Paris. But Patrick Blanc's work is now found all over the world, commissioned and displayed like paintings, neatly bridging the gap between gardens and art. I've come to see Patrick at his seemingly ordinary home in the south of Paris.
Hello, Patrick.
Hello.
Monty. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
But inside, it's anything but ordinary.
Ah, so I can see
Yes.
this at the end. My goodness.
Yes, it's a kind of a tropical forest at home.
Because Patrick has his own indoor vertical garden.
Oh, now it's a little bit more than 3 years old.
Or as he calls it, a mur végétal, a wall of plants.
It's 3 years old.
Yes, yes, yes. And you see, each plant has its own place because there are about 250 species. Huh? Quite
250 species here?
Yes,
Whoa.
yes.
Despite his growing fame as an artistic gardener, Patrick is first and foremost an academic botanist with an obsession for plants from tropical rainforests. And as rainforests account for over half the plant species on the planet, they're a rich source of material for his living wall.
Tell me, I mean, just technically, how do you fix them in? What are they growing in?
There are 2 sheets of felt, you see?
Yeah.
2 sheets, I open, and I put the plant just between the felt, and the roots are growing in the felt in the same way as they are growing among mosses covering the rocks in rainforest.
So they don't need any nutrients?
No. When you have, for instance, limestone cliffs, you have everywhere in Europe, and you see many species are growing as soon as there is some circulation of water. The only important thing is to choose the species which in nature are always growing on vertical or very oblique surfaces.
And how do you keep it watered?
Oh, it's very easy. At the top you have a hose with some holes.
So the water, you have a hose and it drips down?
Yes.
Inside this perfectly ordinary Parisian home, Patrick has created his own miniature ecosystem, complete with lizards, birds, and even an underfloor aquarium. Yet although this is quite unlike most gardens, the plants are still adapting and growing where it most suits them.
In the case of a vertical garden, you see the plant can escape much more. You see, these ficus Ficus villosa, for instance, which is here. I did plant it here. I didn't know it wanted to climb, but now it is at the top, and I think maybe it will be covering the ceiling. So you see, with vertical garden, there are many more surprises because plants are totally free.
Is this, do you think, I mean, other people have called this a work of art. Do you think of it as your artwork? Or do you think of it as your garden? Or both?
No, for me, it's my babies.
Your babies.
I like the exuberance of Patrick's living walls. This one is also in Paris and in the Rue de la Verrerie, and they've been much imitated around the world. Now, Patrick himself is clearly not concerned whether they're art or not, but they challenge the nature of a garden. And a lot of people enjoy them as living art. I'm now leaving Paris to head north, and the next gardener I'm going to meet has taken on a deeply serious subject: war and peace. His garden has been inspired by the countryside that it is set in and its long and troubled history.
This landscape of northern France can feel very familiar to the British eyes. And it does look similar in many ways, but the really big difference is that in this landscape, war raged within living memory and was the scene of horrendous fighting and terrible losses. And the marks of that are still here, both physically, on the landscape itself, and in the community.
The name of the garden that I'm heading towards is Sericourt, near the town of Arras. Sericourt is the creation of Yves Gosse de Gore. He was born and brought up here and identifies personally with the history of the surrounding battle-scarred landscape. This is what inspired him to create this large garden from scratch. The 11-acre garden is divided into many compartments, with the warrior garden at its heart.
Ici, c'est le jardin guerrier, warrior garden, with soldates here.
Ce sont des soldats.
Des soldats.
Ah oui.
Oui.
Ranks of fastigiate Irish yews, each trimmed to an individual height, stand at the ready. Just beyond them are crude faces clipped from cypress.
Ah là là, ils sont quoi? Des visages?
Des visages. Nous appelons ça les masques guerriers.
Ah.
Warrior mask.
Oui, oui.
Yeah.
Yves loves the symbolism of plants, but the garden also has direct images of the brutality that raged in this region just a few generations ago.
Qu'est-ce que c'est les trous?
Alors ici, ce sont des trous de bombes, des cratères.
Ah, les trous de bombe, bon.
Les cratères.
Ce n'est pas les vrais trous de bombe.
Non, ce n'est pas les vrais trous de bombes. On a voulu marquer un petit peu, si vous voulez, le terrain pour montrer que c'était une terre martyre ici, où il y a eu beaucoup de passages, beaucoup d'invasions. Hein. On n'est pas très loin donc d'Agincourt. Les 2 guerres mondiales se sont déroulées aussi ici. Donc c'est une terre qui a vraiment beaucoup souffert. Et c'était une façon de l'expliquer.
I never thought I'd say this, that a hole could be a beautiful thing.
Voilà, c'est un peu spécial de faire des trous dans le jardin comme
oui,
ça.
C'est spécial, c'est différent, mais c'est intéressant.
Oui. De temps en temps, on me demande quel arbre je vais planter là.
Everything in this garden has a story or a symbol attached to it.
Et cet endroit-là, cette avenue.
C'est l'allée de l'infini qui symbolise en fait le fait que la guerre ne mène à rien, que c'est toujours une impasse. Donc il y a un peu dans le fond de la lumière qui symbolise l'espoir. Si on se place bien, on a la lumière.
Ah oui, pas de lumière.
Un tout petit peu de lumière.
Oui. Quand vous avez commencé ce jardin, est-ce que vous avez fait l'art ou le jardin?
Alors, j'ai essayé de faire 3 choses en même temps.
Ouais.
J'ai commencé par une collection de plantes.
Ouais.
Et ensuite, j'ai essayé de créer quelque chose avec ces plantes, de faire de l'art, et puis de raconter en même temps une histoire. Les plantes en elles-mêmes, j'avais envie de les faire parler. J'avais envie de raconter une histoire à travers mon jardin.
Even though Yves started as a plantsman, he is, in a very French way, in love with the intellectual concepts that plants can express. But the garden's idiosyncrasies make it both very personal and yet accessible at every level.
This is a big garden and it's full of ideas, and every corner you turn there's something else going on. And what you feel like, it's a party, the door opens, and as a visitor, welcome it. Come and join it. And it's full of jostling, friendly humanity. Now that's pretty good for a garden. Not many gardens achieve that. But I think what doesn't work is there's no discrimination. And I think art has to leave out more than it includes. And you get a feeling here is nothing has been left out.
The last of these modern gardens is in Normandy, a couple of hours' drive away. And here, all that I've learnt about the French comes together in what I consider a hugely successful artistic work and a lovely garden. This is Le Jardin Plume, the feather garden, made over the past 15 years.
I first came here in winter, and it was very bleak and bare, but dramatic. And you could see what was going on, but you had to guess quite a lot. Because now it's all evident and visible, and I guess at its absolute best, and it's just a joy. Everywhere you look, there's such interesting things going on. For example, the planting goes from the very conventional and recognizable to really quite dramatically modern, using grasses in ways that, a lot of people would say are weeds, and that's not the way you do it. But because it's done so slickly and so well, it just feels sharp and utterly contemporary.
The use of grasses is now highly fashionable, but Sylvie and Patrick Quibel, who made this garden from an open field, have established the perfect interplay between formal structure and the flowing sensuality of the content. It is like beautifully cut clothes that fit perfectly and yet allow the fabric to move and perform.
So you can walk right in amongst the planting, and you have this incredible movement. The wind just sort of riffles through and fingers it. The sound, the texture, the way that you look through something to see everything else just works superbly well. It's a really, really good example of how you work with a space, even if it's an unlikely one, and let things go within constraints. That makes something really special.
The underlying design of this garden is based upon long-standing French formal gardening traditions, like the gardens at Versailles or Vaux-le-Vicomte, but expressed in a very modern way. So there are grandes allées, but they're created by mowing different heights of grass. The hedges are tightly clipped, but in flowing crests and waves. And there is formal water, but cut as another square into the mown grass.
Well, I suppose the big question is this garden a work of art, or is it just a beautiful garden? Certainly, it's full of very sculptural, artistic ideas. I mean, I think that this great block of green box is wonderful, thrilling. Now, it's box, call it a hedge, call it anything you like. This is art for me. But the real way that this works is in the mind. It's got to be an idea. You've got to have the concept of art as a garden, and this is where the French excel. They love concepts. They're very good at intellectualizing, taking an idea and turning it into a garden, and taking a garden and turning it into an idea, and playing with it.
And I think the gardens that we've seen here in France show that they can do what the British, quite frankly, feel embarrassed about. We're clumsy intellectually compared to them. I think this garden is beautiful as a garden, as well as crossing the line to becoming a fascinating work of art. But did Patrick and Sylvie make it with that in mind?
Nous, ça s'appelle le jardin de plumes parce qu'on veut essayer d'atteindre ça, modestement.
Il y a du travail.
C'est-à-dire qu'on veut que le jardin soit en harmonie avec, je ne sais pas moi, le vol des papillons, qui est cette espèce de légèreté, ce plaisir que tout ça soit, je ne sais pas, en harmonie.
Le jardin est beau, ça c'est clair. Mais est-ce que vous avez d'abord fait un objet de l'art? Est-ce que c'est un jardin comme l'art?
Grande question. C'est compliqué. Parce que l'art, souvent, c'est des choses qui sont créées et qui sont... Un tableau, par exemple, c'est fini. Un jardin, c'est peut-être de l'art, je ne sais pas. Mais ça bouge, ça va bouger. Puis si les créateurs s'en vont ou sont morts, il n'y a plus de jardin. Donc c'est très particulier. Donc, est-ce que c'est de l'art ou pas? Peut-être certaines parties peuvent faire penser à de l'art, oui, parce que tout ce qui est dessiné, structuré...
Et c'est comme une sculpture, c'est...
Oui, mais la chose, c'est que c'est
éphémère.
éphémère. C'est quand même un art peut-être un peu éphémère, le jardin.
The ephemeral nature of gardening certainly does make it an elusive medium for art. But I think that this garden achieves it through the combination of its deceptively simple and pared-down layout and the way that the planting is encouraged to be so transitory and loose. There is one final stop to make on this journey, and it is the garden most strongly associated with art in the world, let alone France. It's late summer, and I have returned to Claude Monet's garden at Giverny, also in Normandy. This time, I'm going to see the water lilies in flower in his famous water garden.
When I came here in spring, obviously the water lilies weren't out at all. And it feels wrong to be in France and not come back and not see them. And there they are.
By 1892, 10 years after he moved here, Monet had made enough money from the sale of his paintings to purchase more land to make a large water garden, loosely inspired by the Japanese prints that he collected. For the next 30 years, he was to paint it obsessively, even as the guns of the Western Front began to rumble within earshot of Giverny.
It's funny, because I know what water lilies look like, but I confess that my initial reaction is one of being underwhelmed. It's somehow less than I expected. But actually that's unfair. It's unfair on the plants, it's unfair on Monet and the paintings because it's to get it wrong. The water lilies themselves are not important. What Monet was painting was the light. That's what obsessed him. And light on water, which bounces and is reflected and comes off at angles and shimmers and sinks slightly beneath the water, is endlessly fascinating.
There's no doubt that the pond with its elusive light entranced Monet, as well as providing an escape from the loss of his wife and the horror of the First World War. Monet gave these 8 huge panels to the nation in 1918 as a celebration of the end of the war. But he couldn't part with them or even stop working on them, and they weren't installed here until after his death in 1926. The paintings increase our artistic appreciation of the garden, and visiting the garden enables us to appreciate and understand the paintings all the more. And Giverny seems to have given Monet an endless canvas which he could both plant and provide inspiration for his paintings.
I think that where gardening is special, as opposed to all kinds of other ways of looking at the world, is the relationship of the gardener with the land is intimate. It's something that is very deep. And if it taps something inside you, then it can produce great art.
And what makes French artistic gardens so particular is the ease with which they combine intellectual, abstract concepts with an earthy love of plants. In this series, I've learnt so much about France and its gardens. From how the historic grandeur of Versailles was created, wow, to the way that the medieval monastic tradition makes a modern kitchen garden.
I hope you like the vegetables.
I love vegetables.
From the evolving charm of Corrence to the Michelin-starred restaurant producing all its own organic produce.
It's got body. This is a muscular tomato.
And of course, the influential formal potager at Villandry. And I've seen gardens that set the standard for gardens of their type right across the world. And as I've travelled around France, I've learned that they still respect order, formality, and doing things in the correct manner. But they also take delight in abstract ideas and intellectual concepts. And the French have a deeply romantic streak, running from Josephine's Malmaison to the crazy but wonderful modern extravaganza of Champ de Bataille.
Amazing.
And above all, their love of style and flair in their gardens, as in every aspect of life.
When I came to France as a teenager, I was pretty sure what I wanted. I wanted light, I wanted art, I wanted the sort of creative impulse that seemed to come from the south. And obviously now I've got older, a lot of those things have gone. Some of them have matured and changed, life's got complicated. But the more I visit gardens and travel, it's clear that 2 things happen. One, you start to piece your past together by this new and changing present. As you get older, things make, and through seeing gardens, it's the medium which I can measure out my world. And also, the more that you learn about a culture and a civilization and a people through the way that they make gardens, the more that you learn about yourself.
Celebrate the 90th birthday for one of Australia's most iconic and spectacular gardens, Cruden Farm, on the premiere of Inside Dame Elizabeth's Garden next week.